So we'll get started in just a minute. I just wanted to do a quick welcome and thank you to you all for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Kleeman. I'm the director at the Olson Memorial Library. On behalf of myself and also Karen Saylor of the Eagle River Historical Society, I'd like to thank you for being here with us this evening. I know that there are sort of more attractive ways of spending your evening than in front of a computer, but I think this will be worth your while. Before I introduce you to our presenter, I just want to remind you that even though the library building is closed right now, we are continuing to offer curbside pickup and other remote services. So if there's ever anything that you're interested in getting your hands on or information that you need, and you think, oh, the library probably doesn't know about that, call us. Chances are we can get you connected with what you need. The other thing I want to mention, and I'm sure you all have experienced this before, we are using an online presentation tool in the Northwoods of Wisconsin where our internet access is not always perfect. So if we experience any glitches, stay with us. We've got contingency plans A through D, so we'll get back on track as soon as possible if we experience any problems. So having said all of that, I am so happy that you're joining us tonight for Steven Rogstad to present to us. He is the author, of course, of Lincoln Among the Badgers, Rediscovering Sites Associated with Abraham and Mary Lincoln in Wisconsin. Steven is nationally known for his scholarship in Lincoln studies. He's also a native of Racine, Wisconsin, and currently serves as the Director of Development for the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center. Lots of words. In addition to his long resume of writing and doing scholarship around the Lincolns, in 2008, Steven was appointed Secretary of the Wisconsin Lincoln Bicentennial Commission by then Governor Jim Doyle, and served on the commission's Markers and Memorials Committee. So this is a man who knows of what he speaks. Before I hand things off, I just want to let you know another piece of information I found out today, and I think Steven will share this with us as well. Lincoln Among the Badgers has been selected by Wisconsin Public Radio as a chapter a day book. So contents of the book that we'll be talking about tonight are going to be broadcast on Wisconsin Public Radio starting on January 22nd. So you can have as much Lincoln in Wisconsin as you could possibly want. And having said all of that, I'm just going to hand things off to Steven Rogstad.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to the Eagle River Historical Society. I know, Karen, you're there. Thank you for all your hard work and for the library in bringing this together. It's just a pleasure for me to talk to the people in northern Wisconsin. My wife and I, we vacation up in Eagle River and at St. Germain the second week of July every year. And so coming and talking to this group, it's kind of like coming home. As a matter of fact, my wife's been coming up to St. Germain for 43 consecutive years in a row, so that's a big part of her life. I thought I would talk a few things. I'm not going to read from the book, but I'm going to kind of in quick order talk about some of the stories that are in the book and what this book is about and how you can order a copy, which I hope you'll do, and talk a little bit about the Lincolns in Wisconsin. You may be interested to know that Abraham Lincoln is the most written about person next to Jesus Christ in terms of literature. And we still have on the average of about 50 books that come out annually on Abraham Lincoln in some capacity. But there's never been a book in all that literature about the Lincolns in Wisconsin. And so I've reached this point in my life where I can start doing some books. And this is the first of what I think will be about 4 books dealing with the Lincoln theme as it relates to our state. So with that being said, I'm just going to go through the program real quick. This is Stories from Among the Badgers. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, because we're on screen 1 right down here at the bottom, you'll see the website where you can purchase the book through the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center, which is what the acronym is here. You know, when we see pictures of Abraham Lincoln in Wisconsin, like when we have celebratory events, we usually see him like this, as you can see, and this was in 1959. You see Lincoln in a stovepipe hat, he's talking to a large crowd, and he's holding on that document you'll see the words slavery and freedom. Well, Lincoln never had a beard, as you can see in that illustration when he was in Wisconsin, and he never spoke to those large quantities of people, and he never spoke, for the most part, on the subjects that we most notably know him for. However, when I was able to, I was lucky and very honored to work with Governor Doyle and that administration on putting signage up around the state. You may recall in 2008, 2009, we were in the middle of the recession. We didn't have any money, neither did the commission. The best we could do coming out of 2 years of work to commemorate Lincoln's bicentennial birth is to put some signage in some of the rest areas that you'll see around Wisconsin. There's 3 different signage that's up there. This particular one is in Pleasant Prairie when you come into Wisconsin off of 94 coming out of Illinois. So the Lincolns in Wisconsin. I want to in this book. It's a myriad of things about what this book contains. It's a coffee table book. It's a history book, and it's a travel book. So if you like to have something that you can just pick up and read something without having a cohesive narrative, this book is for you. And if you like to get in the car and take your kids around or your grandkids around, or you like to travel, you want to see some interesting things, this book is for you. And if you just love Abraham Lincoln and you want to know more about him and Mary in the state of Wisconsin, this book is for you. So I've written this book with the idea that I'm writing it for a general audience so that people can get in their cars and go to some of these sites and really, really enjoy seeing some things that they might not have been aware of. The Lincolns were in our state a total of 5 times. Lincoln was here in 1832 when he came up as a militia soldier in the Black Hawk War. It was primarily an Indian war in Illinois, but he trampled up through, eventually, after 3 enlistments. He was in his 3rd enlistment when he traveled up into Wisconsin through Beloit, went up through Fort Atkinson, and was mustered out of service near Whitewater, Wisconsin. He returned in 1859 by invitation. This was a year after the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's a nationally known figure. Matter of fact, the debates were the first political debates that were transcribed on telegraph and printed to audiences on the East Coast. So he is very well known both in the central part of the United States and on the East Coast. He's a celebrity. They invited him to come and speak to the Wisconsin State Fair in Milwaukee in 1859. And he also on that trip ended up speaking also in Janesville and Beloit. And each one of those cities have a different story, which is in the book. Those are the only 2 times Lincoln was here. After he went back in 1859, the following year he was elected president, and he never came back into our borders again. Mary's visits came in 1867 and in 1872. Now, in 1867, she visited Racine, where I'm talking to you from and where I live. She was here for 51 days. This was 2 years after the assassination, and she came up to Racine to investigate a school as a possible educational institute in which to put her youngest son. She also used it as an opportunity to relax and get out of Chicago, where she was living at the time. About a day after she leaves Racine, she embarks on a 2-week Great Lakes boat excursion that took her up Lake Michigan through the locks of Sault Ste. Marie and over to the Apostle Islands. When she returned, about 2 weeks later, she went back to her home in Chicago. She didn't visit Wisconsin again that we know of until 1872, when she spent an entire summer in Waukesha enjoying the medicinal properties of the healing waters there, as they were noted for. And then she ends up going west from Waukesha into Madison, Baraboo, probably saw the Wisconsin Dells and saw some of the rock formations around Portage and Baraboo. So those things we know virtually nothing about. But those visits are covered in great length in my book. I also talk about, it's a history book, travel coffee table book, 384 pages of text, maps, and illustrations. There's 31 stories about some unusual people, places, and events. There's stories behind every one of the Lincoln monuments and markers in Wisconsin. And I added the profiles of 5 people who either knew the Lincolns or were attached to the Lincolns in some capacity. The point of this book was to make the cut. The people whose graves I put in not only had to know Lincoln, but they had to be buried in Wisconsin, because every site in this book is something you can go and visit. So it doesn't talk about every Wisconsinite that knew Lincoln, because they might not be buried in the state, but these 5 were. If you plot out where all these things are, you'll notice there's 3 blips on the top of the map in the northern part of the state. That's Phillips and Woodruff and this Apostle Island story. In the center part of the region, there are 4 things to see. And then you see the preponderance of things down in the south and southeastern part of Wisconsin. Everything is plotted on a map for your convenience. And what's in it is statues, buildings, graves, markers, and monuments. For example, if you look at the monuments, we have 9 heroic statues to Lincoln in the state of Wisconsin. If you go from left to right along the top, that's Kenosha and Madison, Racine, and the far right is again in Kenosha. And then the bottom left to right is Ripon, Burlington, Racine, Manitowoc, and Milwaukee. We have statues everywhere, and each one of them has their own unique histories. I don't write dry history, so I don't just talk about how these statues, the committee work and all that. There are fascinating stories behind every single one of these. I want to talk to you about a couple of these stories. And since I'm talking to my friends in the north, I really want to talk about some of the things pertaining to the north. Mary Lincoln's Great Lakes excursion was unknown to scholars until 2012. So this is brand new research that just recently surfaced. And it's been pieced together through diaries and nautical histories and newspaper accounts. Tad and Mary, and that's the Mary on the left there with her son Tad. Tad, actually his name was Thomas, but when he was born, his father said that his head was unusually large for his body, and he resembled a tadpole. So you always see Lincoln referring to him either as tadpole or short, which became Tad. And they went on this Great Lakes excursion on this propeller-driven boat called the Union, which you see there on the right. It carried about 20 to 60 passengers, and one of the passengers on there was Senator Henry Rice and his wife. Now, Senator Rice founded Bayfield, Wisconsin, and so we don't know why she took this excursion, but she would end up in Bayfield and LaPointe. Possibly Rice was trying to get some good tourism going on in Bayfield and possibly use Mary as a celebrity to go there and sing its praises. We don't know. We don't know. But they left Chicago and they stopped in Milwaukee to take on provisions and food. And I love the story there because you see the Chamber of Commerce there in Milwaukee. Tad is seen with his father in the upper left. This is in February of 1865, just a couple of months before Lincoln was assassinated. But when he's in the Chamber of Commerce, Tad goes ashore, not Mary, and he is dragged into the Chamber of Commerce to meet all of these Milwaukee businessmen. And they are just thrilled to meet 14-year-old Tad Lincoln. And what Tad was telling him is, I was 12 years old when I walked with my dad through the streets of Richmond, Virginia at the end of the war. And the whole nation knew that. They knew that they had come ashore and walked with very little protection through the burning streets of Richmond, Virginia. And Tad was holding his hand the entire time. And Tad must have been very proud of that fact because that's what he had to tell the people in Milwaukee. A cute little story. And then once they were back on board the ship, the boat proceeded to go past Port Washington, Sheboygan, Manitowoc, went through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, went on the southern shores of Lake Superior, and ended up going over to Bayfield and LaPointe. What's interesting is on their way over there, they stopped at Ontonagon, and they stayed with a family by the name of Durfee. And Durfee's daughter, Jean Prince Durfee, was her name, little girl, really loved Mary Lincoln. and warned Mary, when she found out that she was going to La Pointe, she says, well, avoid this particular hotel because it's full of knotholes and the snoring men are just awful. And Mary Lincoln thought this was quite funny, and she gave, these little artifacts to girls that she would meet. It could be a fan, it could be gloves, it could be a hairbrush. And Jean Prince Durfee always had wonderful memories of meeting Mary Lincoln. She said, I never could understand why the press was so mean to her in her lifetime. I thought she was adorable. She was just one of the most beautiful people. And I find that in the Wisconsin recollections, and it's always by young girls who ended up running errands for her wherever she stayed. They thought that she was just one of the most adorable, beautiful people they had ever met. And when she stayed in Waukesha, the young girl there that knew her said, oh, we all said after Mary Lincoln left, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see Mrs. Lincoln again? And they had hairbrushes that they kept for their lifetime from her. But she ends up in Bayfield, and she goes over to La Pointe, and you see kind of this postcard here on the right showing this boat coming into La Pointe, and that's pretty much what Mary Lincoln would have seen. There was a mission church up on the hill, and you see the interior of the mission church there on the left, and Tad, another image of Tad. Tad had no opinion of church. Matter of fact, he was one of those kids you probably would avoid at all costs if you were ever in church. We've all been in church when we've had the rambunctious kid that can't shut up and is overactive and is not paying attention and is getting away with seemingly everything, and the parents seem to be oblivious. This would have been Tad Lincoln. He misbehaved so bad at the age of 14 in the mission church that the priest there had to give him a good reprimand for not knowing how to behave in church. So there's these human interest stories. One of the other favorite places I'd like to talk about is 2 years ago I spent the better part of a day with Marcia Dowd over at the Dr. Kate Museum. And I have to tell you, that is one jewel of a museum up in your part of the state. I think it's one of the best kept secrets. You might wonder why the world's largest penny would make my book. Well, I have to tell you, Lincoln's face on it is on that penny, and that's good enough for me. And I think that when you have this kind of a nonprofit up in your area, and this rich story about how it came to be, and getting to know the story of Kate Newcomb and reading her biographies in the books that have been written about her and the Million Penny Parade. It is such an inspirational story. And I spent the better part of a day there with Marcia Dowd. And then I included this, the museum, it got 11 pages in my book. And all the photographs were the ones that I took that day. And then I went over to Boulder Junction and paid respects to Kate Newcomb's grave. And I put a picture of her grave in the book because you still go there and you still find people putting pennies on the top of her gravestone, which I think is just a wonderful tribute that continues to be made to the memory of Kate Newcomb. So the fact that Lincoln's image was used in this wonderful, benevolent way to raise money for a hospital is a very, very inspiring story, and is a rich part of Wisconsin history that I don't think gets told often enough. The other one that I think is great is the Wisconsin Concrete Park over in Phillips. As a matter of fact, I've been there several times. Every time I go up north, I have to stop there. Fred Smith was a retired logger. He was born in 1886, and he ended up becoming, for the most part of his life, an illiterate logger. And in 1936, he helped his brothers build a tavern on his property, and then he retired in 1948 and just started creating these extremely unusual, what I call folk art sculptures on his property. Today, the property is owned by the Kohler Foundation, which I'm happy to say is a great donor for the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center. They give us grant money for various projects that we do, so I'm glad that I could give them a little plug in my book as well, because they are the ones that both own and provide care for these sculptures. But you can see what Fred Smith here was trying to do. He was trying to replicate the Abraham and Mary statue that we have down here in Racine. And I think it's so unusual because if you didn't have the sign on it that said it's the second of its kind, in the world. It's really the first of its kind in the world. You see these figures here, and if you look at the figures of the head, you'll see that there's Lincoln with the beard on the left and Mary on the right there. But Fred Smith had over 200 of these unusual creations on his property, which you can see today. So if you're anywhere near Phillips, I encourage you go and see the Wisconsin Concrete Park. Down in Sheboygan, we have another concrete type of display, and here's Lincoln, the wood splitter, and that's at the Tellon Memorial Park out in Evergreen, south of Sheboygan. Another gentleman who just started experimenting with creating cement figures, and this is the only, for the most part, patriotic figure he has on his property. You can see Lincoln kind of mauling a log. The log itself, all of that is cement. The log, the figure, the mallet, everything. Quite unusual. But it's in Wisconsin, and it's an unusual marker. The other thing that I love about the book is the cover has this wonderful cheesehead Lincoln. And that was because my wife and I were up at Cherry Fest in Door County. My wife has accused me of being able to see Lincoln's face on a postage stamp in the middle of a pasture a mile away. I think that that's probably true. And I saw this particular piece of art done by David Hipwell, who lives in Oconto, Wisconsin. And I bought his art, and I struck up a correspondence with him, and I asked him if I could use his artwork for the cover of my book, which he graciously allowed me to do. But he has two paintings in the book, and these are those. They're both acrylic. And there are two other oil paintings in Wisconsin. The one on the left from Racine, you can see the one that's based on the photograph. And then the one on the right was done in the 1930s. Large painting that was done for a lawyer. And when the lawyer died, it was put in storage for 65 years in an attic before the heirs finally donated it to the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. So again, Wisconsin artists doing Wisconsin work. So I want to talk to you about this particular statue out in Kenosha. Now, there is two large statues at Carthage College in Kenosha. And you might ask yourself, why in the world would Lincoln be at Carthage College? Well, in the 1840s, there was a higher school of learning in Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln lived, known as the Illinois State University. And through financial cuts and panics, the school eventually moved twice, ended up in Carthage, Illinois, where it changed its name to Carthage College, and then subsequently again, through some more financial reverses, moved up and relocated to Kenosha, Wisconsin. Lincoln, when he was elected president, was named trustee of the college. John Hay, who you see in the middle, is Lincoln's White House secretary. He was in his 20s. He went to Illinois State University and was a graduate. So did Lincoln's eldest son, Robert. He also graduated from there. The man on the right is John Hay, and later in life, and had a very illustrious career in American politics. The story that I love about Hay is he's about 3 weeks before death in the early 1900s. He's on a boat, he wakes up, and he writes in his journal that he had a dream the night before that he was called to the White House to perform some work. You have to understand that John Hay went through 5 presidential administrations. He was a very influential man in American politics. Ended up being Secretary of State. But in his dream, when he gets to the White House, Lincoln is the one that greets him. He knows that Hay has been ill and makes some comment about that, and then says to Hay, well, I've only got a few letters for you to take care of, so you shouldn't have any problem with those. And Hay says in his dream, he says, I was really glad that I could gratify him. And he says, and then I woke up, and he says, the whole dream just left me feeling so melancholic because he just absolutely loved and adored Lincoln. He and the other White House secretary ended up writing a 10-volume life of Lincoln in 1890. And if you want to know how much Hay and his other secretary, John Nicolay, thought of Lincoln, they said that he was the greatest character since Christ. Now, when you live with a man like Hay and Nicolay did and see him at his best and see him at his worst, they saw what he ate. I mean, they knew everything about him. To say that is extreme high praise. These are the figures that are in Carthage, just right at the main entrance. It's called a learning moment. And you have John Hay seated in Lincoln's office. And according to Michael Martino, the artist, what you have is, Lincoln would start dictating or talking about some piece of policy, and then he would be reminded of a story, and he would launch into one of these great stories. And that is what Michael Martino is trying to capture here. It's one of those learning moments where the instructor goes off on some tangent where you learn more about the tangent than you learn more about the curriculum. And that's what is trying to be captured here. To give you an idea about Robert Lincoln, which you see in this particular photograph right at the time of his father's assassination, this is Lincoln's eldest son, who also graduated from the university. Interestingly enough, John Hay's commemorated as a graduate. Lincoln's, who never went there and never attended a meeting as a trustee, is commemorated as being attached to Carthage, but Robert Lincoln is not. And Robert, seen here, had a very also illustrious career in politics. You see him as a young man and through his age. He lived until 1926 and died in his sleep at the age of 82. He was minister to Great Britain, Secretary of War, and again, like John Hay, went through many, many administrations in the American presidency. Here you can see this wonderful depiction of Lincoln. It's the only statue that I know of the hundreds that we have in America where Lincoln is almost smiling. And you just never see that in statuary. Another little story that's in the book is William Cockshaw. I think you're going to love this story. On April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln in Ford's Theater. And they went on a manhunt for Booth, and at the same time they were able to arrest 8 people. There was Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Edmund Spangler, and Samuel Mudd, who has had some notoriety as the doctor who treated Booth's leg. They all received life imprisonment sentences. The other conspirators that were slated to be hanged were Mary Surratt, Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. Mary Surratt was the one that had the boarding house where the conspirators met. Lewis Payne attacked Secretary of State William Seward in his bed with a large knife and almost assassinated him that night. And David Harold was working with Payne, and George Atzerodt's job was to assassinate the Vice President of the United States at the Kirkwood Home. So this was not just John Wilkes Booth acting alone. This was a plot to decapitate the entire Northern government. And these 4 were sentenced to be hanged. Of course, a lot of people didn't believe that they would ever hang Mary Surratt because the federal government had never hanged a woman. And so when the nooses were being made, instead of doing 7 turns in the knot for the noose for Mary Surratt, the hangman only did 5, thinking it wouldn't be used. But then, to his horror, they found out that Mary Lincoln indeed was going to be hanged, that President Johnson had declined any sort of amnesty for Mary Surratt. So you'll see in these photographs here, this is the courtroom in the old Arsenal building. And on the day of the hanging, July 7th, 1865, you'll see the building down here in the center on the lower part with the scaffold. And across the courtyard in that building with the 3 windows, Alexander Gardner, the photographer who worked with Matthew Brady, set up his camera and was going to photograph this event. And if you look at the right, this is how it looks today. So if you want to know how scenes change in time, if you're playing tennis today at Fort Leslie McNair, you're probably playing where Mary Surratt and Lewis Payne and Davy Harold and George Atzerodt were hung. That particular day, the conspirators were brought out and put on the scaffold. Now, I want to talk to you about William Cockshaw because he's the gentleman down here on the left holding onto his post, the soldier you see under Mary Surratt. William Cockshaw was in the reserves. He had been injured in the war, and he really had been stationed there with a lot of other soldiers. They were in the reserves, meaning they were really not good. They couldn't fight anymore, but the war was over. And so all of these soldiers are standing around in the July heat in these woolen outfits, and they have nothing to do. So when the commanding officer came in and said, "Does anybody here want to volunteer for some work?" William Coxshall was one of several men who raised their hands, and you'll see William Coxshall down the lower left, and then you see the man in the shadow to your right of him back there. Then you see the other two under the scaffold. Those four were four of about a dozen that volunteered for work, and Coxshall thought, well, we're just probably going to be assigned to clean up the courtyard and do some menial work. To his horror, he finds out he's been selected as the hangman for Mary Surratt and Lewis Payne. And he's hanging on. So for one full day, July 6th, they hung 300-pound artillery shells in bags as simulated bodies and kept dropping the trap and hanging these bags and putting the trap back up and hanging those bags again and dropping the prop. They were prop knockers, and they knocked those props out for 8 hours in that July sun, practicing for the hanging the next day. So here's William Coxshall now hanging onto his post. Mary Surratt is above him under that umbrella, and he's getting very nauseous because it's about 102 degrees. He's got this woolen uniform on. He knows he's going to hang this woman. And while you can see him kind of now bending over, and you can see him in these sketches behind how they were going to knock out the prop. And he hears Mary Surratt up there. And there were some anecdotal versions of what Mary was saying on the scaffold, like, "Please don't let me fall, please don't let me fall." Coxshall would later say, no, she didn't say that. What it was when they bound her hands behind her and tied her dress down at the knees and at the ankles. They tied it so tight, and her hands behind her so tight, that she complained, "It hurts, it hurts." And the hangman up there on the scaffold said, "Well, don't worry, it won't hurt for long." And Coxshall is hearing this, and he finally has had enough, and he bends over and retches and throws up. And it's all caught by Alexander Gardner on his photographs. So here you can see them again getting ready for the hanging. And here you can see Coxshall on the left losing it. And he hung Mary Surratt and Lewis Payne. The interesting thing about this is William Coxshall, one of the four prop knockers in that very famous assassination trial, is buried in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. So we actually have one of the executioners for the Lincoln assassination. And he's buried there, died in 1922, as you can see. Another story is Alexander Gardner. That one's a little close to home because Alexander Gardner is a photographer. He was one of the first daguerreotypists in America, and he becomes the first person to ever do aerial panoramic views of Chicago. He was very, very famous later in life, but he actually lived in Racine and married in Racine and had a young daughter named Ida Louise, and decides to embrace somewhat as an entrepreneur, being a pioneer photographer, a daguerreotypist. So if you've ever been to antique shows and you see those very small, usually in a gold frame with a velvet case, those are daguerreotypes, and he specialized in those and actually entered some photographs of his in international competitions and won medals over in Paris for some of his work. He was award-winning. And he went around. He ended up coming back to Racine one time to visit his in-laws, and while he was in Racine, his daughter died, and he buried her in Racine. He took one of the most influential pictures of the Falls of Minnetonka, and the poem was made, Hiawatha. Longfellow said that he was inspired by Hessler's views of the falls, which inspired him to write Hiawatha. He first met Abraham Lincoln in 1857. He had a very luxurious gallery in Chicago, and Lincoln was kind of told, you should go get your picture taken by some of his friends. And so Lincoln goes in to get his picture taken, and Hessler saw the condition of Lincoln's hair and kind of combed it and made it look good. And Lincoln looked at it and took his hair, according to one version, took his hands and mussed up his hair and told Hessler, if you have my hair the way you want it, nobody would recognize me. So they'd recognize me if my hair looked like this. That's one version of it. Another version is that Hessler kind of messed it up, which I doubt. But anyway, this was the first photograph that Hessler took of Lincoln in 1857. And believe it or not, Lincoln thought this could actually be used as a campaign photograph, if you can believe this, and could not see any objection to the hair. He says his wife really objected to the picture because of the condition of the hair. But Lincoln thought, this is great. This is a great likeness of myself. And in 1860, when Lincoln is running for the presidency, he set up an office, his campaign office, in the governor's room and the governor's private study in the old state capitol in downtown Springfield. And they said, well, we need some really good campaign photographs. They said, well, who should we get? And the decision was, get Hessler. Lincoln couldn't go to Chicago, so they asked if Hessler could come down to Springfield. And you may recognize these following photographs. They're the most famous beardless photograph taken of Abraham Lincoln, and you may recognize them. These two, you can see, I love these photographs because he took them by a large window. That's all we know. He had Lincoln for 4 hours on a Sunday, and he said he positioned him by a large window in the old state capitol. I suspect it was probably one of these large windows that you see in these two rooms where Lincoln worked. But we don't know which room. But these are some of the photographs that came out of that session. This very pronounced nose that Lincoln had, which is really quite interesting. These are the two most famous ones. And these were actually printed and sold to the public, and each one of these photographs sold 10,000 copies. So people would buy these and actually frame them and hang them in their living rooms. So today we hang pictures of our family and friends, and it was very popular for people to hang pictures of the President of the United States, generals in the service. Those were the kind of prints that you put on your walls then. And these two were extremely best-selling portraits that Hessler took. And as a matter of fact, when Lincoln's sister-in-law remarked that she never saw photographs of her brother-in-law better than Alexander Hessler's. Well, I say that because Alexander Hessler is buried in Racine. And here you see his gravestone, and here's little Ida Louise off to the left, her little grave. And then all of Hessler's children, some of whom died in California, all were shipped back and are all buried in the Hessler plot. The story coming out of the book is William Henry Noble, and I happen to love William Henry Noble. Noble is another person who is from Wisconsin, and he entered into the war in 1862. He only served for 2 months before he was so injured and debilitated that they sent him pretty much where William Coxshall was, into the reserves in Washington, D.C., where he remained for the next 3 years doing paperwork and some sundry duty. When Lincoln was assassinated, William Henry Noble at first was tagged as being part of the posse to go and search for John Wilkes Booth. But then they changed his orders and they said report to the White House. So on the day of Lincoln's funeral, now you may think that today, especially when you see presidential funerals, everything is very choreographed, everything is decided in advance, everything has a script book to it. There was none of that in the Lincoln assassination. As a matter of fact, William Henry Noble is standing out on the White House grounds. Military men had marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House from the Capitol. The funeral in the East Room, which was going to be attended by 600 people, was going to be underway soon. And they had handpicked 8 people to be pallbearers for Lincoln's casket. Well, they decided they needed about 21 more men. And so William Henry Noble was tapped on the shoulder and they said, "You've just been assigned a pallbearer to Abraham Lincoln's casket." So the 21 were added to the 8, and the 29 then accompanied Abraham Lincoln's funeral. And this is the 1,700-mile funeral route from Washington through Baltimore, up through Philadelphia, New York, Albany, all the way over to Buffalo, all the way back to Cleveland, and then they were back into Columbus, and then over to Indianapolis, and up to Chicago, and then down to Springfield, Illinois. If you can imagine, and it was going to take about 2 weeks, and they were going to be on a train, and so this is Lincoln's funeral car. You can see here, one of these soldiers is one of the 21 men. So you see some of the men guard the funeral car, some are attached to the casket to carry it, and they are the only people that are allowed to touch Abraham Lincoln's casket during this rather grand funeral procession. To give you an idea of just what kind of funeral Lincoln had, he had 12 public funerals, 12 different hearses, 12 different catafalques in 12 different cities. And you see the one here in Philadelphia. You see this one. This is New York. You see Columbus, Indianapolis, all different catafalques. And if you see the press of the crowd, if you go down and you look at the large one in the middle, if you look down below the casket, you will see the heads of the soldiers marching along. We don't know which one of those is Henry Noble. But if you look, when you figure about 100,000 people crammed into the streets of Philadelphia and walked with that hearse or tried to view the body. In New York, here's a great picture of New York, the crowd waiting for the hearse to come by. And then you see it because it's moving, it's blurred, but you see the hearse coming by and you see the soldiers marching. One of those very well could be Henry Noble. We do not know. But they marched alongside that casket for miles and miles and miles. Then they had to carry it to where it was going to be viewed. There were 12 public viewings of Lincoln. Here's New York. Now, if you look at the image on the left and you see that second floor open window and it looks like there's two kids in that window, one of them is Teddy Roosevelt, who is looking out at Lincoln's funeral and was there that day. On this picture here on the right with the nation mourns, this is New York City Hall. And you can see the people going in. Many people would be standing in line, and these lines were sometimes 9 miles long. They went outside of town before the train even arrived. The doors were thrown open. They would get in line, and they had an average of 1 second each to see Lincoln's face. Very often in these towns, the body would, the time had come, the body had to leave. They closed Lincoln up, took him away. The lines were still 4 or 5 miles long. Those people still stood in line to look at an empty platform just to see where the body laid, even though they could not see him. In New York, someone thought it would be great fun because they were bored standing in line to flick a cigar up on the Nation Mourns banner, which ignited and draped down onto the crowd. And once you got into the New York City Hall, you went through basement catacombs until you came into the rotunda, and then you went up 22 steps to see Lincoln's face, and then you had to go back down 22 steps to leave New York City Hall. Very often, the women were very much emotional seeing Lincoln's face. They tried to hug him, to kiss him. There were people that tried to tuck things into his casket. Lincoln traveled with a change of clothing because they had to dust him off because of being jostled and manhandled at these viewings. And then somebody would inadvertently get there 1 second to look at Lincoln and then go down that first step and want to look one more time, and they'd look back over their shoulder, miss the first step, and all of a sudden you had avalanches of people on these stairs going down. So these guards that are around, you wonder how much of this Henry Noble saw. In New York, there were sketches made of Lincoln in his casket. This is versions of that were made by Pierre Morand. It was the only time Lincoln's body was photographed. And Here you can see another one in Buffalo. I mean, you can just imagine if you were Henry Noble or one of those pallbearers with that press of the crowd around the hearse as you're marching through these streets. And finally, they arrived back in Springfield on May 4th. And Springfield didn't have a hearse, so they borrowed one from St. Louis. And then in 2015, they replicated the Lincoln funeral in Springfield. And so they actually rebuilt the Lincoln hearse. So I kind of show you the original, and then you can see the reproduced version. I should add that that hearse is still being used by a special funeral home that built it. So if you want to die and you want to have your remains taken to the funeral in the Lincoln hearse, you can pay for that. Just so you know. The body was taken out to Oak Ridge Cemetery in outside of Springfield, and Henry Noble and his men put Lincoln's casket in that receiving vault and gave the key to Robert Lincoln. And here's various versions. That receiving vault has gone through several renovations over the years, but it's still there below the tomb. And so and the funeral car is no longer in existence. It burned up a long, long time ago, early 1900s. What's interesting about it is Henry Noble is buried in Manitowoc. He's our pallbearer of the Lincoln funeral, and he is buried in Manitowoc. I think it's a great story, and he's the kind of guy that Lincoln would have loved having as a pallbearer. He was a guy that did his job, even though he ended up going into the reserves. Every single one of the pallbearers that took care of Lincoln on that 2.5 weeks of traveling all came out of the reserves. All of them were ones that had been injured or somehow limited from performing regular military duty. And so those were Lincoln's pallbearers. So those are some of the stories that are contained in this book. The beardless Lincoln in Wisconsin, and the trips by Mary and her widowhood. I should add that this is a picture that was made of Mary in probably around 1872, 71. And she visited a spirit photographer, a very, very well-known spirit photographer out in Boston by the name of William Mumler. And he specialized in taking photographs of people and having deceased loved ones show up behind them. And so here's Mary with the image of Abraham Lincoln behind her, which she always believed was authentic, and she kept that photograph with her until she died. There's stories about the Milwaukee statue, which moved 5 times in its lifetime. And, we're also dealing with the image of, the issue of what do we do with Abraham Lincoln today? There's been stories and some talk about removing Lincoln from Bascom Hill in Madison, as well as other places. So I'm hoping that this book will familiarize people with the motivations for why these statues have been placed where they've been placed. Here's another one that's in Racine. And I want to tell you that the one that's in Racine, the other one that's in Racine, put up in 1943, was the very first monument ever erected in the United States to a president and his wife. It was the very first ever erected to Mary Todd Lincoln, or a first lady. And it's unusual because it is also hand carved out of granite and not made out of bronze. And so you can just imagine Frederick Hibbard and the work he had to do to create these flowers on her, both her dress and in her hair. So those are some stories pertaining to the Lincolns in Wisconsin. And like I say, there's 31 of them. But I have enjoyed immensely doing the research, and especially in my trips to northern Wisconsin and seeing those unusual things. And I would be happy to take any questions any of you might have, or comments that any of you might have.
Thank you so much, Steven. Most of you are probably muted right now, so if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and maybe say your name so Steven knows who he is talking to. Well, Stephen, I promise I was listening the entire time. I have a question about the very last thing you said.
Oh,
Um,
no.
why is it that you think that Mary Todd Lincoln kind of captured public imagination in the way that maybe previous first ladies hadn't?
Well, I wouldn't say, it's that statue is somewhat of an anomaly because one of the great mysteries is Mary Lincoln's reputation in the American consciousness has never really been very good at all. She had a very controversial life. She wasn't always agreeable. She could be very difficult. And there's other aspects of her career and her life that weren't necessarily always they were in contrast to sometimes the character and the personality of her husband. So in one respect, we judge Mary somewhat unfairly because we always compare her to Lincoln, two different people. Um, the other thing is that Lena Rosewall, who gave all of her estate, she said when she died, she wanted all of her estate, $20,000, to go to the building of a monument to Abraham and Mary Lincoln, not to Lincoln, but to Mary Lincoln as well. It's a very interesting conundrum because when you look at the Mary Lincoln literature up to 1935 when Lena Rosewall died, there isn't much of it. There isn't much of it, and there's only about 2 books that are out on her at that time, and they're not nearly as insightful as what we would have today. Of course, having done more research in the last, 70 years on her, but Lena Rosewall evidently saw something in Mary Lincoln that very few other people had, and here you have a monument to a woman that really wasn't all that popular. And she saw her as being very much responsible for having polished Lincoln, having prepared him for the presidency, having groomed him, having, really been influential in making him presidential and successful. And I think that that's what Lena Rosewall was really trying to do, is to memorialize the woman who was very much not only Lincoln's partner in marriage, but political partner. And Karen, I have to say how much I appreciate you being here tonight and arranging for this. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate the invitation.
Oh, I was delighted to do it. I had a question for you, Steve.
Yeah.
I was trying to follow your chronology of Mary Lincoln's visits to Wisconsin, and she, if I remember my history correctly, she was once institutionalized for psychiatric issues. Where in that visiting chronology would that have happened?
That's a great question. Well, the assassination of her husband occurred in 1865, and then she came to Racine and did the Apostle Islands boat trip in 1867. Then she traveled around. She traveled a great deal. She was always traveling. And then she was in Waukesha in 1872. She was institutionalized in 1875, which would be 3 years after she was last in Wisconsin that we know of. And she was incarcerated for only about 4 months. It was a very brief period of time, and the story about that is really fascinating because the way that she got out of the institution, she was really a conniver. She called the press. She called the press and tried to make a public case for how her son had railroaded her into an asylum to get control of her money. And she got some female journalists to pick up the story, and she was able to orchestrate her own release and go into the custody of her sister. So that story just in and of itself, aside from the reasons she was put there in the first place, which I will say were legitimate reasons, and that idea that she was put into so that her son could get control of her money is just pure fiction. Just pure fiction. But she believed that to be the case. But she needed to be there when she was there. But she was only there a very brief period of time. But, she never was mentally well the last decade of her life, really, Not that she had to be institutionalized, but at the time that she was. Yeah.
Thanks.
You know, and the other thing is, you know, you think Abraham Lincoln only lived 56 years. He's only 56 years old when he died. And Mary, if you look at that photograph there, the last picture of Mary, which is taken 10 years before she died, she was only 63 when she died. So, you know, these were lives that really were tragic on many levels. And, you know, you look at the last pictures of Lincoln, if I scoot way back up here and I show you that photograph of, picture down there in the lower right, that picture was taken just about 2 months before Lincoln died. He's only 56. The war and that job just nearly killed him, and both of them didn't age well at all. And we like to think that they were senior citizens when they died, and they weren't. They were 56 and 63. So.
Well, thank you for doing this, Steve. We've enjoyed having you up here in the North Woods with us.
Oh, I can't wait to come back, and I'm hoping to be up there this summer. And if I come up this summer, I'm going to let you know, because I'm going to stop by. If we're all open and functioning again, that would be a wonderful thing.
We're certainly planning on it. We're very optimistic. But yes, absolutely. Come and see us in Eagle River if you get back up here.
Well, I'm always right down the road. I'm always by Albert's, right down there at St. Germain. So I'm right down the road from you. And I have a wonderful little story of Eagle River, because I think it was about 3 years ago I came up, and we were having lunch. We were having a breakfast somewhere, and we had a young waiter who handed out leaflets about walking history tours of Eagle River. I thought, well, this is interesting. This is right up my alley, you know. I'll take a couple hours off on a Wednesday night and go into Eagle River and do this walking tour. And so I went online and I made my reservation, and I went over, and it was a young woman, I'd say maybe maybe late 20s. And she was doing this walking tour, and she had her little stool. And I think it was about an hour tour. We started, I think, at the railroad depot, if I remember right, and we walked around the downtown area. And turned out that the waiter was her fiance, and he was plugging her walking tours. I thought that was great. That was great salesmanship on his part. He was plugging his fiance's walking tour. Every time he waited on a table, he gave out a leaflet about her walking tour. But I went through that walking tour that night. It was fascinating hearing about the history of the buildings in your downtown.
Hey, well, come on back and visit our museum. We'll tell you some other stories.
You bet. I'll be happy to. If I'm up that way, I'll definitely stop by.
Again, thank you for coming and visiting with us. We appreciate it. Night.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Everyone stay safe, and let us know if there's anything we can do at the library to help.
I know.
Okay. Take care, Stephen. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.